Hunchback Ghost.
The woods surrounding the small town of Brambleridge had a really sinister and disturbing vibe. The tall pine trees seemed to lean in, casting unending shadows over the winding trails. Even on sunny and bright days, there was that inescapable sense of dread lingering in those daunting forests. But it was only recently that the true source of that negative aura finally revealed itself. On a crisp autumn night, a young forest ranger was doing his regular patrol along the outer trails near the edge of the woods. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, he noticed something strange out of the corner of his eye. A faint, ghostly figure, gliding between the tree trunks. At first he simply ignored it, thinking it was just a trick of the fading light. But when he turned to get a better view, this supernatural form took on an unmistakable silhouette. It was the hunched form of a woman, her back grotesquely arched as if she were carrying some monstrous deformity. She seemed to be wearing the tattered remains of an old dress, hanging loosely on her skinny frame. Her head was tilted forward, her face hidden by a tangled mess of greasy, lifeless hair. The forest ranger froze, his blood running cold, as the ghastly apparition approached with that chilling sound of bones knocking together. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, that supernatural apparition dissipated into the twilight hues, leaving the poor ranger trembling and wondering if his eyes were just deceiving him. The whole encounter lasted maybe a few seconds, but that chilling sense of dread it planted in him was impossible to forget. With trembling hands, the ranger finally radioed in the bizarre sighting to his base. A research team was quickly assembled to investigate this frightening experience. Their initial investigations into the town's history and folklore revealed some serious stuff. Buried in the archives were old records and whispered legends about the persecution and obscure death of an unknown hunchbacked woman in the 1800s. You see, this poor woman was born in the 1830s with a severely curved spine that made her look all twisted and deformed. From a young age, the ignorant townsfolk treated her like a freak, calling her names like demonic offspring and cursed beast. Wherever she went, people would scream and recoil in disgust at her disturbing appearance. As she grew older, the abuse and cruelty only worsened. Children stoned her and hurled insults at her hunched silhouette, while adults banned her from shops and public spaces, branding her an abomination that brought bad luck. She couldn't even find sanctuary at church. The ministers condemned her distorted form as an outrage against God's perfection. People regularly assaulted her, spitting on her and chasing her out of town with threats of violence. Driven into total poverty and despair, the shunned woman was eventually forced to seek refuge in the wilderness beyond the town, lurking within the shadowy confines of the forest. Legends say she survived off wild berries and small animals, always shivering from the cold and constant rains in the region. The townspeople's cruelty didn't allow her to live with even the bare minimum of comfort and dignity. Then in the winter of 1863, she just vanished without a trace. The popular story was that the Brambleridge Hunchback froze to death out in the woods, damned by God and rejected by society. But an even darker rumor persisted, that the vengeful townsfolk had banded together in a murderous rage, hunting her down and brutally putting an end to her life in an act of uncontrolled violence. Whatever grisly fate befell the hunchbacked woman, one thing was clear. This poor person's suffering had been endless. Now it seemed her tormented spirit had returned to haunt the very town that had mercilessly shunned her over a century ago. Armed with these grim historical narratives, the research team set out to see if there was any truth to the forest ranger's supernatural claims. Over the following weeks, they carefully set up video cameras and sensors along the trails where the bizarre sighting occurred. Initially, the equipment didn't detect anything out of the ordinary, just the typical nighttime forest sounds. But on the third night, one of the cameras captured a faint, ghostly disturbance lurking between the trees. The footage started normally, with the familiar noises of critters and the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. But then a chilling, rattling sound of bones started growing louder, as if it were approaching the camera. It was the unmistakable sound of bones knocking together, but with no footsteps to indicate where it was coming from. As the sound reached its peak, a spectral form emerged from the shadows between the tree trunks. Just as the ranger described, it was the hunched, twisted silhouette of a woman's body, her frail frame bent under some unseen, horrible weight. Her skinny limbs swung lifelessly as she floated through the darkness, her path marked only by that mournful clacking of bones. A tangled mess of greasy, grimy hair shrouded her face, concealing her features. Time seemed to slow as the ghostly figure neared the camera, its ethereal form flickering and contorting. For a few agonizing seconds, it looked like the apparition would pass directly through the camera lens. Instead, the withered, hunched specter just glided off to the side, disappearing once more into the blackness with that harrowing, agonizing sound. Upon reviewing the footage, even the most skeptical researchers were struck by a chilling realization. Somehow the audio had become corrupted, turning that eerie rattling into a harsh, distorted shriek that grated on the senses. It was the anguished cry of the unknown hunchbacked woman, her plaintive wail echoing across the centuries of her eternal torment. In the following weeks, more and more sightings of the ghastly figure were reported by locals and forest rangers. Strange three-toed footprints like twisted, deformed feet began appearing on the forest trails. Chilling moaning sounds, like the creaking of gnarled timber, could be heard echoing through the woods on windless nights. The paranormal events grew increasingly violent and disturbing. Campers awoke in the dead of night to the sound of maniacal laughter coming from the darkness outside their tents. Hikers encountered piles of debris strewn across the paths. One unlucky ranger was even pelted by a sudden hailstorm of pine cones and rocks, leaving a confusing trail of three-toed prints at the scene. But the most terrifying incident happened on a pitch-black November night, when a young couple was changing their car's flat tire at the forest's edge. While doing so, they claimed to have been suddenly assaulted by a swirling vortex of debris that violently hurled itself at them from all directions. Amid the onslaught, they heard that same harsh shriek of distorted frequencies captured by the research team, drowning out their screams of terror. When the maelstrom finally subsided, they found themselves surrounded by crude, childlike drawings etched into the dirt and tree trunks. Each one depicted the hunched, monstrous silhouette of an inhuman figure, rendered in streaks of mud and what appeared to be bloody scratches from jagged twigs. And scrawled across the dusty rear window of their car was one final message: Beast. The couple fled in terror, peeling out and leaving the cursed forest behind. But the haunting was only just beginning. In the nights that followed, they were tormented by vivid nightmares of the hunched, twisted figure. Its bone-rattling wails reverberated through their dreams, shrill and unsettling. In the darkness, they would awaken to see the spirit's deformed silhouette lurking in the corners of their bedroom, the entity's piercing shrieks echoing endlessly. The couple became mere shadows of their former selves, pale, hollow-eyed, and plagued by paranoid delusions. Convinced the hunchback's spirit was stalking them, they began scrawling bizarre symbols and warding sigils all over the walls and floors of their home using blood, feces, anything they could find. Police were called on multiple occasions after concerned neighbors reported the sounds of screaming and objects being flung about inside the house at all hours. Then, on one tragic night, the couple apparently snapped. In a drug-addled frenzy, they attempted to exorcise the beast by brutally mutilating their own bodies, severing flesh with household implements. When authorities finally breached the residence, they found the couple a tangled, nearly dead mesh of flesh and viscera amid a thick pool of blood and offal. Scribbled across every wall and surface was the couple's crazed handwriting, with hundreds of repetitions of a single plea: please, kill the beast. Both survivors remained permanently catatonic after the event, their minds shattered by the ordeal. To this day, they remain confined in a dimly lit asylum, rocking back and forth and muttering the same haunting request beneath their breath: kill the beast. The forest surrounding Brambleridge remains indefinitely cordoned off by authorities. Strange reports of disembodied moans and the clatter of bones still occasionally emanate from the wood's depths on moonless nights. But the few brave souls who have dared to investigate have invariably fled in terror, after encountering the freshly mutilated remains of the latest souls, to incur the hunchback's eternal wrath.